Hello, this is Tarregor. This video is a Twitch stream that was not edited, so it's going to look like a Twitch stream. Welcome to my vision of World of Warcraft Classic Plus. The design direction of my vision of Classic Plus is essential to confirm that of retail WoW, Circus Shadowlands, and a private service, Vanilla Plus and Turtle WoW. This is partially because this aims to fix Vanilla WoW's many problems first, flush out and polish with starter data second, and add new content third. This is part of a playlist of videos. Check the video description for a link to the playlist. To document displayed is my vision of World of Warcraft Classic Plus, and the document's version number is version 1.5.16. All versions of the document are based upon patch 1.12.2 of World of Warcraft. If you just want to know about the general design direction of my vision of Classic Plus before you otherwise look into this, then watch the introduction video in this playlist, or read the document yourself and look at the list of major features. The link to the document is on my channel's About page. That, and I do not have a team of people, or however, worked with me to make an actual private server out of this. To develop your design thus far, it ain't done yet. Now, first off, this entire section of the document that I'm about to go over, what I had in mind writing this is that I managed to get an entire proper battle group's worth of servers, at least. So yeah, just keeping that in mind while you write this. As unrealistic as those expectations are, it's even more unrealistic that I actually get to do to the game what I wanted to do with it in the first place. Because it's more realistic to actually buy the World of Warcraft IP outright than it would be to actually get Blizzard Entertainment to do what you wanted to do to the game, despite me not actually having money. Anyways, moving on. The Classic Not Plus / Vanilla Classic servers that already exist are not to go away if this game actually manages to come out, so don't worry about those. Also, a fair warning, I expect this video to be a much debate. I'm not so sure about some of this stuff myself. Now, before the execution of these server changes comes the agenda. What I want to do as opposed to how to do it. I want to prevent servers from becoming ghost towns after the tourists leave by temporarily multiplying the server's population cap by 2, doubling it. Temporarily doubling the server's population cap. And having dynamic respawns to do not punish semi-isolated players very much. And then getting rid of the dynamic respawns altogether and lowering the population cap back down to normal after a set amount of time has passed on a given server. I want to alleviate faction imbalances after they begin, but before they reach critical mass, hopefully. By offering faction-specific realm transfers to the bigger faction, and by imposing non-economic, non-combat penalties upon the bigger faction. All realm transfers will only be allowed for the sake of faction balance. The smaller faction can only transfer off if it gets so bad that it's basically a one-sided server. I want to create a system through which servers that die will naturally be replaced with new servers if the server's remaining player base allows it. I want to make sure that certain regions have their own servers from the very beginning, such as Brazil and Latin America. And I want to restrict multi-boxes to their own servers in regions that are big enough for me to comfortably divide servers like that. Speaking of Brazil and Latin America, remember during the release of Vanilla Classic back in 2019 when Brazil and Latin America didn't get their own servers? Well, what they did was they joined American servers. And then something like a month later, I think it was a month or a few weeks later, Blizzard finally decided to make Brazilian and Latin American servers. But it was too late. They already had their roots set on those US servers. And not too many of them joined them. And it really did not turn out so well. Yeah, so I'm going to make sure that they have their own servers from the very beginning among other ethnic groups. Specifically not including the Chinese, because Chinese government control of video games and all. They wouldn't let me do what I want to the game. It's not them, it's our government. Anyway, for the content release schedule, see section number 4.0.2, Content Release Schedule. Now do keep in mind, this entire document includes all items of item levels above 65 being squished down to item level 65. All raids that are harder than Upper Blackrock Spire being turned into 40-man raids, except for world bosses. Those raids exclusively drop in item level 65 epic items with chances for items that are required for legendary weapon quest chains. So there's only going to be one tier of raids, and it's going to be hard. So also, the PvP ranking system is being revamped a lot. In fact, we replaced with a new one, and PvP rewards are also being revamped. So yeah. Now then, a content release schedule for every server will be as follows. concerning when the server comes out and not when the game releases. Upon release of the server, all content not mentioned below will be available to players, including even Nax Ramus and the Garage Quest chain. Again, all the raids are going to be tier 1. Except World Bosses will also be tier 1, but they're only going to drop out of level 63 stuff. And it'll be 20 mans. Because World Bosses are hard enough as it is anyway. World Bosses are hard enough as it is anyway, what with players interfering and all. Anyway, one day after the AQ gates open, the Scourge Invasion will begin. 1 month after the Scourge Invasion ends, the Elemental Invasion will begin. And then 1 month after the Elemental Invasion begins, the Elemental Invasion will end, and no more non-holiday events will ever happen on the servers, unless I decide to make new ones, which I do not have any in mind. Now then, back to the server stuff. These changes are made under the assumption that the population these changes are not made under the assumption that the population will explode, the population of the game overall. These changes are made under the assumption that a ton of the initial players will be tourists, and that all new servers will have a ton of people who will not stick around for more than a month or so, and there will have plenty of people who will stick around after that. It is better to have less servers and add more servers, concerning the server players upon release, so I shall plan accordingly. Hold on. Put my stream manager up. It is very important that no form of sharding or layering be implemented because a complete lack of those will be a significant draw to Classic Plus for a substantial percentage of people. Each server's population cap will be increased from 3,000 to 6,000 at the start of each server's release. Oh, by the way, you might be thinking, gee, there's what's going to be mega servers. Well, I'm going to address that later in this video. Anyway, moving on. Each server's population cap will be increased from 3,000 to 6,000 at the start of each server's release, and then at the end of week 6 of each server's release, their population caps will be lowered from 6,000 to 4,500, and then a week later, they'll be lowered from 4,500 to 3,000 and stay there for the rest of the server's lifespans. This will prevent many servers from becoming ghost towns due to tourists. Each player will be allowed to freeze their subscription for up to 30 days per account, details below, in order to grant some sort of alleviation for Oh, I already put this here. Okay. For the first 7 weeks of each server's release, subzones that are determined by the game to be quotation mark congested quotation mark will cause the clients of all players within the subzone to no longer render or process players, including party members, non-player characters, and objects that are over 45 yards away from the player at the most, or over 20 yards away at least, outside of level 1 through 5 zones. Or however far the level plus 3 aggro radius plus 5 yards is. However, it's level 1 through 5 subzones, they'll instead be 10 yards away. So, for example, instead of game clients having to render and process maybe 1,000 players and their actions within a 200-yard radius, they'd only have to render and process maybe 50 players within a 10-yard radius. All map and minimap features will be excluded from these limitations. This will also come with an undispellable debuff red debuff that persists through death. Congested area. The distance at which your client may render the process is surrounded has been forcibly reduced to prevent the server from lagging. This will wear off if you go somewhere with less players, or if enough players leave your subzone. You may regardless go to your account settings to freeze your subscription to this game. If you freeze your subscription, then your subscription's duration will stop elapsing, but you won't be allowed to play this game until you unfreeze your subscription. An account may only freeze its subscription to this game for a total duration of 30 days. Maximum and total duration of 30 days. You may freeze your subscription to this game to wait out the congestion. Anyway, this will make it dramatically easier for the servers to handle the starter zone rushes. For the first week of each server's release, all mini-map tracking will be disabled while in flight paths to make it marginally easier on the servers. For the first 7 weeks of each server's release, dynamic respawns will be enabled on a sub-zone by sub-zone basis, as opposed to a zone-by-zone basis, for all uninstanced, non-consistent areas, excluding the uninstanced portion of Razor Band Downs and all rare mobs. Subzones are defined as places such as Echo Isles. Not all of Durgar, but just Echo Isles. Cardos. Not all of Dunmoral, just Cardos. The Valley of Wisdom. Not all of Orgrimmar, just the Valley of Wisdom. and the Dwarven District. Not all Stormwind, just the Dwarven District, etc., etc. So, for example, if the Red Rocks in Mulgore contains 20 players, and the Golden Plains in Mulgore, which is right next to it, contains 500 players, then both subzones will be on separate respawn timers, even though both subzones are in Mulgore. I might, quotation mark, divide, quotation mark, especially large subzones so that less players who do not need lowered respawn timers do not get lowered respawn timers. The threshold for triggering dynamic respawns and how dynamic respawns will be have yet to be determined beyond the fact that they will not count player corpses, player ghosts, or players on air taxis as players. The minimum respawn timer from dynamic respawns will be either 1/10 of the normal respawn timer or 30 seconds, whichever is higher. As an exception, there must be at least 15 seconds between when the enemy dies and when the corpse despawns, barring, obviously, when the corpse gets skinned or other quest time disease on it that makes it despawn. The aforementioned 15-second timer may delay the respawn timer for the relevant entity. As an exception to the above, in subzones that contain caves that have more than 5 non-friendly NPC spawn points within the cave, the minimum respawn timer from the dynamic respawns will be either 2/5 of respawn timer or 120 seconds, whichever is more. The aforementioned part about corpses taking at least 15 seconds to despawn still applies. This exception exists to be easier on players that are in caves, and the minimum respawn timer for subzones that contain caves without being entirely composed of caves, such as Play Main Rock, might be lowered, or such subzones might be instead be quotation mark divided, quotation mark up. Enemies that will not be subject to dynamic respawns include all faction non-player characters that are not escorted for an escort quest, the prisoners that run out of the Sake's entrance, and the sewer beast. For example, Gammon will still be subject to the dynamic respawn timer. Servers shall update the dynamic respawn timers once per minute, and not every single time a player enters or leaves each subzone, in order to make it easier on these servers. Some of these things, not including dynamic respawns, might also be done during the Encourage opening event. Account creation will be allowed for up to 1 month before release, so subtime will not elapse until release, and the real names and lists will not be revealed until 1 hour. Just 1 single hour before release lets the player base get an idea of faction balance on each server prior to release by making Discord servers for each server, and then not have the consequences of losing their character's progress or worry about when deciding where or not to move from another server to get away from the other faction, while still giving the guilds that care, the guilds that actually give a shit, enough time to decide which server to play on before release. This will be a huge help with faction balance. Furthermore, character creation will be allowed from 45 minutes to 1 minute before release, at which point all players will be booted from the server and not be allowed to reconnect until release. This will give people about as much time as possible to reserve their names without taking much of a risk with faction balance. Design note, otherwise, people will make Discord servers far in advance to pull the Alliance of Horror on each server, just like it did in Vanilla Classic back in 2019. 9. Population maintenance, preventing faction imbalance. All new accounts will have a 10% chance of being recommended to a low pop server if it is of the server's preferred server type. Do note that recommendation does not mean that you have to pick the server. Excuse me. All new accounts will have a 65% chance of being recommended to a new server if the player's preferred server type. If there are any of that server type in that region, a quotation mark new quotation. That is, if there are any of that server type in that region. A quotation mark new quotation mark server is one that is less than 8 weeks old. All new accounts before picking their first server will, if they pick PvP as the preferred server type, be prompted to choose where they like the Alliance or the Horde more, and be given a brief description of the two factions and their races to aid them in their decision making. If they pick Alliance, then there's a 25% chance that they'll be recommended to a server that has a faction imbalance in favor of the Horde, or vice versa, they pick the Horde if they like the Horde more instead. This choice will not lock them to making only Alliance or Horde characters on that server. Only making a character on that server will lock your choice as such. Servers with less faction imbalances will be recommended before servers with worse faction imbalances. Paid server transfers will never be offered to players. For the sole purpose of alleviating faction balance issues, I'll be carefully allowing free server transfers. The manner in which I choose to do it will cause some servers to get a good faction balance after having to sell a bad one, but unfortunately cause the servers that have it really, really bad to have an even worse faction balance. Note that paid server transfers, cross-realm zoning, and server mergers are all despised by a non-negligible amount of the player base, including former players who have the potential to come back if these things are not offered. Yeah, again, including former players who have the potential to come back if these things are not offered. These are not people that you hear anything from. When people discuss this game, these people are never involved in the discussions because they quit the game due to various problems and have not looked back because they have zero faith that the problems will ever be solved. If they hear that the problems are solved, then there's suddenly going to be more discussion about the game because there will be more people that are interested in the game. Anyway, moving on. Yeah, that's something that a lot of people who make video games, official ones even, do not understand. The people that actually say stuff about their games are not the only people who are interested in them. And they're not the only people who would actually fucking buy them. Anyway, moving on. Whoops. I just closed something. Oh, I closed my stream manager. Hold on, let me open it back up. Stream manager. But my mouse too close to the other monitor. Anyway, server transfer will not be offered for PvE or RP servers, no matter how bad the faction balance gets on those servers. Nor will they ever be allowed from one server to a server in a different region. Server transfers will only be allowed for certain PvP and maybe RP PvP servers. Players will not be allowed to transfer from PvP to RP PvP servers, nor vice versa. An account will not be allowed to perform a server transfer to a server that has not opened the gates of Entourage more than 24 hours ago if any character on the account has accepted the Shifting Sands or has completed the quest to get it. I'm probably going to change that to an earlier quest in the quest chain. Anyway, an account will not be allowed to perform a server transfer if any of the account's characters have the Platinum, the Discs of Olum, an item that drops once per server, basically, from Cthulhu. And if nobody turns it in, and if the guy that has it just destroys the item without turning it in, then it'll drop again. When a player performs a server transfer, all the account's characters on that server will immediately be transferred from server A, the server being left, to server B, the server being joined, and players who are already on the recipient server are never required to change their names if the transfer has the same name as the players on the server that is being transferred to. Instead, the transfer must perform a name changes instead under all circumstances. Concerning the prioritization for which servers are eligible to be transferred to for the sake of faction balance, servers with lesser faction balance will always be prioritized over servers with a greater faction imbalance. So there's going to be a maximum of 4 servers per region at a time to allow server transfers to it. 1 for imbalances in favor of the alliance that allow multi-boxing. 1 for faction imbalances in favor of the horde that don't allow multi-boxing. 1 for I'll just say it again. 1 for imbalances in favor of the alliance that don't allow multi-boxing. 1 for imbalances in favor of the alliance that do allow multi-boxing. And similarly for the horde. This does unfortunately mean that servers with horrible faction imbalance will be left in the dust by rare that less servers reach critical mass than that. Yeah, by rare that less servers reach critical mass, at which point their faction imbalance gets a lot worse really fast. It is fair to have less servers with remarkable faction imbalance than to have more servers with remarkable faction imbalance, even if it means that the ones with worse faction imbalance are a lot worse off than they otherwise would be. A server will not be eligible for transfers to or from it for the sake of faction balance until the server has been out for 8 weeks, no matter how bad it gets. That is 1 week after the server's population cap is lowered from 6,000 to 3,000. Yeah, 1 week after it's lowered to 3,000. So as the population has time to stabilize before transfers open for it. Faction imbalance on the server will be defined as such, preferably via automation, concerning only characters that are logged in while being at level 10 or higher, and not concerning before the server is 8 weeks old. Faction imbalance is obtained. Concerning that stuff, faction imbalance is obtained when the average population of one faction over a span of 2 consecutive weeks is at least 20% greater than the average population of the other faction over at the time span. On all PvP and RP PvP servers, the login key will always prioritize the currently smaller faction. This is not determined in the same way that the server determines whether or not it has a faction imbalance. It's determined by how many characters of each faction are online at the time. That is, this only refers to this and not everything else in the here. And not everything else in this video. Not everything else in this video. Every time a player logs on to a server that's defined as having a faction imbalance in that character's favor, the player will immediately receive a pop-up message saying that the server has a faction imbalance in your favor, and that for that reason, you are eligible to get a free server transfer. Players who have not spent at least 40% of their slash played... Hold on. Okay, that's better. Players who have not spent at least 40% on a server within the past 2 weeks during which they have played WoW Classic Plus will not be eligible for a transfer from that server to another one, should transfers be allowed for players on that server for the sake of faction balance. Until they've spent at least 40% of their slash played over 2 weeks on that server, unless of course any other players are not allowed to transfer off that server by then due to the faction balance having been fixed by then. When server transfers are no longer necessary for the sake of faction balance, a warning will be given out, and server transfers will still be available for the next 48 hours. As if the server still had the same faction balance, so that guilds have time to properly migrate to their new server without getting split apart. Hopefully, anyway. When a server has a faction imbalance that is at least as bad as 5 to 6, but is better than 2 to 3, then free server transfers will be offered to these servers for the larger faction, but only to servers that have a faction imbalance against the transfer's favor, and a server's player base shall experience the following effects until the faction imbalance is better than 5 to 6. All accounts that have no characters of the larger faction on that server may not create characters of the larger faction on that server, and shall be told to pick a different server if the player wants to pick that faction, due to faction imbalance. If this means that you can't play with your friends, then maybe your friends should be good friends and take that free server transfer so that they can play with you. All players of the larger faction will have to wait for an extra 5 minutes after hitting the enter world button before actually loading anything, and they shall be told that they are being forced to wait because there is a faction imbalance in the player's favor, and that they can take advantage of a free server transfer if they don't like it. All players of the larger faction will have to wait for an additional minute during all other loading screens before actually loading anything, excluding Zeppelin/Boat/Battleground loading screens, and they should be told that they're being forced to wait for the same reason as for the Enter World loading screen. All players of the larger faction will have to wait for 30 seconds, an extra 30 seconds, before being allowed to release their spirit after dying, and they'll be told that they are being forced to wait because of the faction imbalance in the player's favor, and that they can take advantage of a free server transfer if they don't like it. All air taxi/flight paths for the larger faction will be slowed down by 1/3, and they'll be told via pop-up window upon embarking that they're being slowed down because of the faction imbalance in your favor, and that yada etc. free server transfer. If the larger faction is the Alliance, then all boats except for the Ratchet to the Booty Bay boat, and Booty Bay to Ratchet boat is the same one, will be slowed down by 1/3, and it'll be told the same scene as for the flight paths. If the larger faction is the Horde, then all Zeppelins will be slowed down by 1/3, and they'll be told via pop-up window upon entering the Zeppelin that the same stuff as for the Wind Riders flight paths. Now, when a server has a faction imbalance that's at least as bad as 2 to 3, but is better than 1 to 9, then free server transfers will be offered to this server for all players, but you can only transfer to servers of the same server type that have a faction imbalance against the transfer's favor. I was making sure I wrote something there. Yeah, against the transfer's favor. Any server's player base shall experience the following effects until the faction balance is 5 to 6 or better. All accounts that have no characters of the larger faction on its server, players of the larger faction. I just changed it. No longer will the smaller faction be able to transfer off at that point. They'll only be able to transfer off when it gets a 1 to 9 or worse. Made servers that have a 2 to 3 a faction imbalance between 2 to 3 and 1 to 9 not allow the smaller faction to exfer off. That's the change log for the next version of the document. I'm still working on the next version of the document as I find changes today. Anyway. So yeah, I just changed this part. When a server has a faction imbalance that's at least as bad as 2 to 3, but it's better than 1 to 9, then free server transfers will be offered to this server for players with the larger faction, and not the smaller one. But you can only transfer to servers of the same server type that have a faction imbalance against the transfer favor, and the server's player base shall experience the following effects until the faction balance is 5 to 6 or better. All accounts that have no characters of the larger faction in the server may not create characters of the larger faction in the server, and shall be told to pick a different server if the player wants to pick that faction, due to faction imbalance. Again, if this means that you can't play with your friends, then maybe your friends should be good friends and take that free server transfer so that he can play with you. Or just reroll and do the server. Forgot to mention that part of the last one. For the last one. Anyway, all players of the larger faction will have to wait for an extra 15 minutes after hitting the Enter World button before actually loading anything, and it should be told that they're being forced to wait because there is a faction imbalance in your favor, and that you can take advantage of a free server transfer if you don't like it. All players of the larger faction will have to wait for an extra 3 minutes during all other loading screens before actually loading anything, excluding Zeppelin, Boat, and Battleground loading screens, and be told that yada etc. free server transfer. All servers of the larger faction will have to wait for an extra 90 seconds before being allowed to release their spirit after dying, and they'll be told that they're being forced away because there is a faction imbalance in the player's favor, and that they can take that yada server transfer, etc. All air taxis / flight paths for the larger faction will be slowed down by 2/3, and they'll be told via pop-up window upon embarking that yada server transfer, etc. If the larger faction is the Alliance, the boats get slowed down by 2/3, except the Ratchet and Booty Bay boat, vice versa. And if the larger faction is a Horde, then the Zeppelins get slowed down by 2/3, and still you can take advantage of a free server transfer if you don't like it. If a server, now moving on, if a server has a faction imbalance of 1 to 9 or worse, then they basically give up, so there's restrictions of servers and the faction imbalances between 2 to 3 and 1 to 9 shall be lifted, and the free realm transfers will end, and then the server will allow realm transfers to the smaller faction for any other server in the same region, and then the server will be converted into a PvE server 1 month later, because that's obviously what the server's player base wants to play on. A PvE server, as such, yeah, because it's obviously what I want to play on, a PvE server. As such, all players with negative PvP ranks, more on that in a different video that I already made, will be promoted to rank 0, among other things. A server that is listed at full for more than 40% of any given non-holiday week will allow free transfers off a server unless the server has a remarkable faction balance problem, in which case only the bigger faction will get those free transfers off the server. Oh, I forgot, a lot of free transfers off the server is full. Either way, people may only transfer to servers that are eligible to be transferred to for the sake of faction balance, as was mentioned above. If the server has 199 or less sole players on it for 2 consecutive weeks, then free realm transfers will be offered to all players on that server, regardless of faction balance, and all faction balance-based penalties upon the larger faction, if applicable, shall be lifted until the server has 200 or more total players on it for 2 consecutive weeks, including the dead hours. If a server is 199 or less sole player for 2 consecutive weeks, or a GM arbitrarily decides that it's not a dying server anymore. If a server is 199 or less total players on it for 2 consecutive weeks, then any players with a character on it that are above level 29 that log on over the course of the next week may vote, 1 vote per account, on whether or not to wipe the server and restart its concert release schedule due to the death of the server. If more than half of the remaining players vote no, then the vote will be reissued in 1 month, should the population not be sufficiently higher by then. If more than half of the remaining players vote yes, then the existing players will be given a 1-week period in which they may change the decision, and if it stays that over half of the players who voting yes for the whole week, then the server will be wiped, and it will be locked out for a month, after which the server will be turned into a fresh server. And its fresh server will be officially announced on the official forums for at least 3 weeks prior to the server's opening. In the server list, each realm's faction balance will be listed as X%/X%, divided up or down to the nearest integer. Down. Closer. Round up. If closer to 50%. Round down if below 50%. The first X will be blue, indicating the Alliance, whereas the second X will be red, indicating the Horde. If a server is less than 1 month old, then the word new will be displayed in white text instead of X%/X%. These faction balance measurements will not be measured what the balance currently is, these measurements in particular, that is, but instead it will be a measurement of the average faction balance over the past 2 weeks according to the metrics defined above. Now that's server regions. Among the obligatory realms, there will be Brazilian realms, General Central South American realms, very many. Oh, I forgot to delete that part. Russian realms, Japanese realms, South Korean realms, African realms, Australian realms, and general oceanic realms in our regions as necessary. However, if the government of China will demand to have more control over the game than I'd like to have, that I'd like them to have, and they will, if I allow them to have, and if I try to have Chinese servers at all, they will. Anyway, yeah, basically I'm not going to let the Chinese government decide how the game goes. That's why that's why I don't want there to be any Chinese servers. It shall be ensured that at least one of each type of server exists for every major European language, lest the European forums light on fire, just like they did in 2019. The game's price in non-United States currencies will be equivalent to roughly how much it costs in whichever country's money to exchange that money for 60 USD before taxes for the digital quotation mark box quotation mark and slash or 15 USD before taxes for a subscription fee. So, for example, if an Argentine peso is worth 1/60 of the United States dollar, then a digital quotation mark box quotation mark of WoW Classic Plus will cost 3,600 Argentine pesos if you pay in said pesos before taxes, and a subscription will cost 900 Argentine pesos per month if you pay in said pesos before taxes. And it certainly will not cost the US equivalent of $3 before taxes for a subscription if you buy it in Argentina. This game is not for poor people who should be saving their money for things that they actually fucking need, such as food. For lack of better words, it will be ensured that nobody, especially not gold sellers, can go and buy the game and its subscription in a different country in order to pay drastically less for it than they would in a different country. In there or another country. Other server changes. There shall be neither sharding nor cross-realm zones in this game, barring cross-realm battlegrounds, unfortunately, in order to prevent shit like wind trading from happening. In any way, shape, or form, period. No cross-realm zones, no sharding, period. Except cross-realm battlegrounds. No matter how hyperbolically bad the alternative is. It is extremely important those things not be implemented, as having iron goes to repel very many players from Classic Plus without drawing anywhere near enough players to the game to compensate for the loss of players. The quality of life change. If somebody gets a name change, everybody in his guild and on his friends list will be automatically notified via in-game mail and vice versa. A new server population designation shall be made called very low, 200 to 499 players. A new server population designation will be made called dying, which is under 200 players. Some servers will allow multi-boxing and others will not. Approximately 20% of all servers for each region that has enough servers will allow multi-boxing. That is, to have at least 5 servers. server type that is not RP or RPPVP will allow multi-boxing, and whether or not they allow multi-boxing will be stated in the game realm selection UI. Players who have been conclusively found to violate this will be given a choice of either receiving a ban of at least 1 month to all their accounts, or being forcibly transferred to a random multi-boxing server of the otherwise same server type that, if applicable, has a faction imbalance against the player's favor. Unfortunately, small regions will allow multi-boxing on most or all of their servers, depending upon how many realms they have. The player will be given 5 minutes upon being caught to make their decision. If no decision is reached by then, the game master will perform the realm transfers regardless of the player's input. Oh, by the way. Oh, some servers not counting RP or RP PvP servers. Remember to make all RP and RP PvP servers disallow multi-boxing. That's pretty important for RP. Anyway, back where I go. Furthermore, multi-boxers are not allowed to bypass faction restrictions on PvP or PvP servers under any and all circumstances. Being caught doing this will result in what a game master deems to be the player's non-primary faction's characters being deleted on the spot, and irrelevant accounts not being allowed to make characters of that faction anymore on that server, barring an appeal to the game master. The character limit, that is how many characters you can have on a server and not the length of your name, will be increased from 8 characters per server to 10 characters per server, allowing you to have 1 player of each class in the same faction and up to 2 bank alts to go along with them, or on PvE servers, 1 player of each class and 1 bank alt. PTR servers will allow the usage of non-whitelisted add-ons, giving add-on developers a place in which to test their add-ons before actually releasing them. See section number 11.0.8, Add-on Workshop for more information. Basically, this game had a problem. Basically, Vanilla Classic had a problem with add-ons, such as the Spy add-on. As such, all add-ons must be whitelisted by the game masters before you are allowed to use them. You're only allowed to use the add-ons that are on a whitelist. The game will not let you load the add-ons otherwise. Period. The Enter World button just will be grayed out. And then if you manage to enter world anyway, you'll immediately get booted. Anyway, next up. Actually booted during the loading screen. Anyway, 1 PvE server per region, and only in the largest regions, will be a quotation mark permadeath server, which shall be labeled as such in the in-game realm list. Design note: if the player base is masochistic enough to cry out for it, then there will be a PvP permadeath server for those regions too. On permadeath servers, all player characters that die cannot be resurrected, even by spirit healers, and all players will be unable to learn all resurrection spells and be unable to craft goblin jumper cables and their extra large variant, and the Regan vendors will not sell the seeds for the spell Rebirth, nor will Iron Tree Stoppers or Wanderers drop Ironwood seeds. And I just remembered to make this change, nor will SCV and ZG mobs drop Stranglethorn seeds. And Battlegrounds in the entire PvP ranking system will not exist on those servers, and on those servers, the Vidare Elixir will give you a buff that lets you talk to Garion instead of killing you. And all auction house NPCs will say that you don't have anything valuable enough to auction, and mail trading will be disabled, except for mail from NPCs and Game Masters and trade from Game Masters, in case they so please. Design note: make sure Veil Straws can't res players in a random Blackhead encounter on your servers. However, as an exception, level 60 characters may use the auction house, they may mail items to level 60 characters, and they may trade items to level 60 characters. Let all 40-man raids be legitimately impossible to clear after the changes I made to them that apply to all servers. The changes of 40-man raids apply to all servers. Are what applies to all servers. Anyway, server transfers may be made from permadeath servers, but not to them, so faction battles will probably be worse on permadeath servers than on other servers. Again, there won't be any PvP permadeath servers unless the player base is masochistic enough to really want one. You'll still be able to log in and do stuff as a ghost after you die on permadeath servers. Such as talking to other players or doing guild-related stuff, like doing guild master stuff, guild moderation stuff. And finally, when a player attempts to create a character on a private dev server for the first time, the player must go through 2 confirmation windows, just in case you're a new player. Confirmation window number 1. Well, not you, the person watching this video, but someone else. Confirmation window number 1. Hold on. That's fair. Confirmation window number 1. Warning! All players on this server that die can never come back to life, no matter what. If you don't like it, then play on a different server. Buttons, yes on the left, or no on the right. Confirmation window number 2. Are you really, really sure that you want to never come back to life if your character dies, no matter what? Buttons, I'm doing this on purpose, on the right. That means yes. Or, let me change my mind, on the left. That means cancel. And yeah, that's all I got for server-related changes. The next video will be about general profession changes. Oh, I did so much stuff for professions. Thanks for watching.